For most of human history, work was not something people celebrated. It was survival. It was backbreaking labor under the sun, tied to the seasons, dictated by feudal lords, and often viewed through a spiritual lens as a punishment or a necessary burden. Then, in the span of just a few centuries, that entire world view fractured. Something shifted in the minds of millions, and with it, the foundation of how wealth would be created, distributed, and pursued across the globe. What began as a theological dispute in 16th century Europe would eventually become the invisible operating system of modern capitalism. This is not a story about money first and belief second. It is a story about belief that accidentally invented a new kind of money culture. When reformers challenged the authority of the medieval church, they did not set out to design an economic model, yet their reinterpretation of faith, duty, and human purpose quietly rewired the relationship between labor and value. At the heart of this transformation was a radical idea that your daily work, no matter how ordinary, could be a direct expression of divine will. This concept, often called the Protestant work ethic, did not emerge from a single sermon or a single book. It grew from a cultural atmosphere that redefined success, discipline, and time itself. Before the Reformation, the prevailing view in much of Europe separated the sacred from the secular. Monks and priests were seen as pursuing higher spiritual callings, while merchants, artisans, and farmers occupied a lower rung. Profit was often viewed with suspicion, and accumulation beyond necessity was morally questionable. The Reformers flicked this hierarchy. They argued that God did not distinguish between a monk in a cloister and a weaver at a loom. Both could serve the same purpose through faithful, diligent labor. But this was not just about dignity. It came with a psychological engine. Certain theological traditions, particularly those influenced by Calvinist thought, introduced a profound sense of individual responsibility. If grace was not something you could purchase or earn through rituals, but something already determined, then how did a believer live with certainty? The answer, culturally speaking, was to look for signs. A disciplined life, moral restraint, economic prudence, and relentless productivity became the visible markers of an inner calling. People began to treat idleness not merely as laziness, but as a spiritual danger. Time itself became sacred. Every hour wasted was a gift neglected. This mental shift did not stay confined to churches. It spilled into workshops, counting houses, and early market towns. Families began keeping detailed ledgers.
Merchants reinvested profits instead of spending them on luxury. Artisans perfected their craft, not just for survival, but as a form of devotion. The psychological reward for hard work was no longer just bread on the table. It was a sense of moral clarity, of order, of purpose. And because that purpose was tied to visible results, it created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more you worked, the more you produced. The more you produced, the more you accumulated. The more you accumulated, the more you could reinvest. And because extravagance was frowned upon, that reinvestment compounded. What looked like a religious practice quietly functioned as an economic multiplier. Within a few generations, this cultural blueprint began to outgrow its theological origins. It no longer required a sermon to sustain it. It became a habit, then a norm, then an expectation. Communities that embraced these values found themselves at a structural advantage in trade, manufacturing, and early financial systems. Their institutions rewarded punctuality, contract enforcement, and long-term planning. Their schools taught discipline alongside literacy. Their legal frameworks evolved to protect property and enforce agreements. The spiritual calling had become an economic culture, and that culture was about to travel far beyond the borders of Reformation Europe. As these cultural habits solidified, they began to interact with the emerging machinery of early modern commerce. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of joint stock companies, colonial trade networks, and the first stirrings of industrial production. In this environment, the psychological discipline born from religious conviction proved remarkably adaptable. It no longer needed a pulpit to function. It could live in a ledger, a factory whistle, a school bell, or a merchant's daily routine. What had once been framed as spiritual obedience transformed into economic rationality. The same restraint that once prevented a believer from indulging in luxury now prevented a business owner from squandering capital. The same emphasis on moral accountability evolved into contractual reliability. The same reverence for time became the foundation of wage labor and productivity metrics. This was not a sudden revolution, it was a slow calibration. Societies that had internalized these behavioral norms found themselves naturally aligned with the demands of scaling production. Capital accumulation, which in earlier eras had often been drained by aristocratic consumption or religious tithes, was now routinely channeled back into expansion. Banks emerged to serve reinvestment rather than mere safekeeping. Insurance, accounting standards, and double-entry bookkeeping flourished in regions where these values were strongest. The cultural expectation that work should be systematic, measurable, and continuously improved became embedded in the very structure of emerging markets. But the shift went deeper than numbers. It changed how people perceived their relationship to effort and reward. In pre-industrial economies, labor was often tied to immediate needs. You worked until you had enough, then you rested. The new ethic disrupted that rhythm. It introduced the idea that productivity itself was a virtue, regardless of immediate necessity. This created a psychological framework where growth became the default objective. Rest was not eliminated, but it was rescheduled. Leisure became something to be earned, planned, and justified. Even the concept of a career, as a long-term trajectory of skill development and advancement, owes much to this reorientation. People began to view their professional lives as projects, not just occupations. Education systems adapted to this reality. Literacy and numeracy were no longer just tools for reading scripture or managing estates. They became instruments of economic mobility. Schools began emphasizing punctuality, obedience to schedules, and the division of labor long before children entered factories or offices. The classroom itself became a training ground for the industrial mindset. Meanwhile, the moral language surrounding wealth continued to evolve.
Accumulation was no longer inherently suspicious. It was reframed as stewardship. The responsible management of resources, the creation of jobs, and the reinvestment in communal infrastructure were seen as extensions of the original calling. Philanthropy, endowments, and public works became socially acceptable outlets for surplus capital. This helped ease the moral tension between personal wealth and communal responsibility. Yet, the system was not flawless. As these values spread, they also generated friction. Not every society shared the same historical conditions. Agricultural rhythms, communal land practices, and different philosophical traditions did not always align with the push for relentless productivity. Trade and colonization would eventually force these models into contact, often through coercion rather than organic adoption. The very discipline that fueled economic growth in some regions was sometimes imposed as cultural superiority in others. The Protestant work ethic, once a deeply personal spiritual framework, became a template for economic organization that could be exported, adapted, or resisted. By the 19th century, the original theological scaffolding had largely faded from public discourse. Industrial capitalism no longer needed sermons to justify long hours or strict management. The habit of work had become self-sustaining. Factory owners, corporate managers, and policymakers inherited a culture that already valued efficiency, deferred gratification, and continuous output. The moral language was secularized, but the behavioral architecture remained intact. People still woke up early, still tracked their hours, still measured success by output and accumulation. The sacred had been replaced by the systematic, but the rhythm endured. And that rhythm was about to accelerate. The 19th and 20th centuries turned this cultural blueprint into a global phenomenon. Railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and eventually assembly lines connected markets that had once operated in isolation. The economic behaviors forged in European workshops and merchant houses traveled alongside goods, capital, and ideas. But globalization did not mean uniformity. As these work disciplines encountered different societies, they were translated, hybridized, and sometimes contested. In East Asia, for example, Confucian traditions of educational discipline, familial obligation, and social harmony merged with industrial demands to create highly competitive, export-driven economies. The original theological framing was absent, but the behavioral outcomes aligned remarkably with the older Protestant model. In Latin America, colonial legacies, informal economies, and strong communal ties produced different adaptations where resilience and flexibility often compensated for rigid institutional frameworks. In Africa and South Asia, post-colonial states navigated the tension between imported economic models and indigenous practices of labor, land, and reciprocity.
The result was never a simple copy-paste of European capitalism. It was a complex negotiation. Yet, the underlying pressure remained.
Economies that could organize labor around predictable schedules, reinvest surplus, and prioritize long-term planning consistently outpaced those that could not. This created a global hierarchy of development that still echoes today. The cultural expectation that work should be continuous, measurable, and tied to progress became embedded in international institutions, trade agreements, and development policies. Even nations that never experienced the Reformation found themselves adopting these standards to compete in global markets. Schools worldwide began teaching similar values: punctuality, individual achievement, career planning, and economic literacy. Corporate structures mirrored them too. The modern corporation, with its emphasis on performance metrics, quarterly targets, and continuous improvement, is the direct descendant of that early cultural shift. The spiritual calling had fully transformed into professional identity. But with this transformation came a paradox. The same ethic that encouraged frugality and reinvestment eventually birthed an economy built on consumption. As production scaled, markets needed buyers. Advertising, credit, and planned obsolescence emerged to absorb the very wealth that discipline had created. The original message of restraint collided with the commercial necessity of desire. People were still taught to work hard, save, and plan for the future, but they were also constantly encouraged to spend, upgrade, and consume. This tension shaped modern life. It produced unprecedented material prosperity, technological innovation, and global connectivity. It also generated new forms of stress, inequality, and environmental strain. The psychological reward of meaningful labor was sometimes replaced by the anxiety of perpetual performance. Work became both a source of identity and a source of exhaustion. Communities that once viewed productivity as a moral duty now navigated burnout, gig economies, and the erosion of job security. The cultural script had not disappeared. It had fragmented. Some embraced it as a path to independence. Others questioned whether relentless growth could be sustained. Yet the underlying architecture remained visible in how societies organize time, measure success, and distribute opportunity. The Protestant work ethic did not dictate every economic decision, but it established a default setting. It taught generations to view effort as investment, to treat time as a resource, and to believe that progress is achievable through discipline. Even when those beliefs were challenged, they shaped the terms of the debate. Alternative models, cooperative economies, and movements for work-life balance all had to respond to a cultural baseline that had been normalized over centuries. The global economy, in many ways, still runs on that old rhythm. It is embedded in how we hire, how we promote, how we educate, and how we define a meaningful life. The original theological debate is long over, but its economic echo is everywhere.
Today, we live in a world that inherited that rhythm without always remembering its origin. The spiritual language has been replaced by productivity apps, performance reviews, and personal development frameworks. The idea that your work defines your worth is no longer tied to divine calling, but it remains culturally dominant. We measure ourselves by output, by titles, by the accumulation of achievements and assets. We schedule our days in 15-minute increments, optimize our routines, and treat rest as something to be managed rather than simply experienced. The machinery of modern capitalism still operates on the same foundational assumptions: that growth is necessary, that effort should be visible, that discipline yields reward, and that time must never be wasted. But we are also reaching a point of cultural recalibration. The environmental limits of endless production, the psychological toll of chronic overwork, and the growing awareness of systemic inequality have forced a re-examination of what we inherited. Younger generations are questioning whether productivity should be the central metric of human value. Movements advocating for shorter work weeks, universal basic income, and community-centered economies are not rejecting hard work. They are challenging the assumption that work must always scale, always optimize, and always tie identity to output. They are asking what happens when efficiency becomes an end in itself. The answer may not lie in abandoning the values of discipline, responsibility, or innovation.
It may lie in remembering that the original framework was never meant to reduce human life to a production line. It was meant to give ordinary labor meaning, to align daily effort with a larger sense of purpose, and to build communities where prosperity served stability rather than endless expansion. The historical lesson is not that the Protestant work ethic was flawless. It is that cultural beliefs shape economic systems more deeply than policy or technology alone. When a society internalizes a new relationship with time, effort, and reward, it doesn't just change its habits, it changes its trajectory. Global capitalism was not born in a boardroom, it was born in a shift of conscience. And as we navigate automation, climate constraints, and redefine notions of success, that shift remains relevant. The question is no longer whether we should work hard. The question is what we are working toward, and whether our current definitions of progress still serve human flourishing. The structures we inherited are powerful, but they are not immutable. Cultures evolve, economies adapt, beliefs are reinterpreted. The same flexibility that allowed a 16th century religious idea to become a global economic force can also allow us to redesign that force for a different century. We can honor discipline without glorifying exhaustion. We can value productivity without sacrificing well-being. We can build systems that reward contribution while recognizing that human worth is not a ledger. The story of how work became central to capitalism is not just a historical record, it is a mirror. It shows us how ideas become institutions, how habits become economies, and how the invisible assumptions we carry shape the world we build. If this exploration resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We break down the hidden forces that shape economics, culture, and human behavior, one deep dive at a time. Thank you for listening.